Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. This is a very special event. I'm thrilled to be here to introduce the curator's introduction to the British Museum's exhibition, Luxury and Power, Persia to Greece. I'm Paul Collins. I'm the keeper of Middle East at the British Museum, and I'm delighted to not only welcome you to the talk, but of course, to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. Jamie Fraser. My colleague in Middle East, who's the curator for the ancient Levant and Anatolia. And he is, of course, the lead curator for our exhibition, Luxury and Power, Persia to Greece. Jamie has worked on archaeological projects all over the world: Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Kashmir, Greece, Cambodia, Australia, and the Solomon Islands. He's currently excavating at an important site in Jordan, a British Museum excavation exploring a 4,500-year-old olive oil factory at a site called Kirbat al Ghazlan. So it's my huge pleasure to welcome Jamie and pass over the baton to him to introduce you to Luxury and Power. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul, and hello everyone out there joining us for this lecture. It is my real pleasure and joy to be able to say hello as you join us and to introduce what has been sort of all-consuming in my life for the last couple of years, which is this exhibition, Luxury and Power, Persia to Greece. This exhibition is slightly different, I guess, to the more standard exhibitions that the British Museum does and does so well, I think, which tend to be quite regionally specific or culturally specific or even biographically specific. So recently we've done exhibitions on the Scythians or Peru or Nero. This exhibition is taking a concept, and that concept is that of luxury and how objects of luxury are also objects of political prestige and political power. And what it's trying to do is to take that concept and pull it all the way across different cultures, across time and space, stretching from Central Asia all across the Middle East into Southeastern Europe. And it's doing it about 600 BC to about 100 BC, give or take. Now, we know a lot about this period because, of course, this is a period coincident with the rise of the mighty Persian Empire, the largest empire the world had seen to this point, and of course the very real territorial ambitions of this empire as it pushed westwards into Europe to bring it into conflict with the smaller city-states of ancient Greece. Ancient Greece isn't a unified nation at this point, but a collection of independent cities, one of which was Athens. We know an awful lot about this period. We know an awful lot about this conflict by our very rich, very deep written sources, the historical record. But of course, these are sources that are authored by the Greeks. We don't know what the Persians thought of the Greeks or on this emerging conflict at the far western edge of their empire. Persian historical records, they do exist, but mostly they are administrative, bureaucratic pieces of paraphernalia. The Persians, ancient Persians, almost certainly had strong narratives, histories, stories, but this was an oral historical culture. So these histories have been performed by voices that have long fallen silent. That means when we look back at the Persians, we do so with our hand placed over one eye. We're doing it through the eyes of their self-declared nemesis, the Greeks. That means we must be aware of issues of historical bias. And those issues of historical bias are particularly pertinent when it comes to the issue of luxury. Now, one of the key tropes, I guess, that the exhibition is looking at is the court of the ancient Persian king. And you'll hear me say quite a lot during this lecture, the word Achaemenid. The word Achaemenid is like using the word Windsor, I guess. This is the dynastic family who were ruling the ancient Persian Empire at this time. And once upon a time, the Achaemenid family had been a tribal family that were nomadic. And you still get nomadic flavors in the way that the Persian kingship was set up. And one of those flavors was the fact that the Persian court wasn't based in one imperial capital city, but it moved seasonally between 5. And as the court moved around its empire, it did so with remarkably ornate, elaborate tents. We don't have them anymore, of course. Textiles don't survive in the archaeological record. However, what you're seeing now is a 17th century Ottoman tent from the Ottoman court that's in one of the museums in Germany. And it kind of gives us a sense, perhaps, of the kind of opulence that these tents represent. Now, when I was talking about that issue of historical bias, keep that tent in mind when you come to read the words of Herodotus. So Herodotus, an ancient Greek author, he's writing about 50 years after these events, and particularly in this one, the Battle of Plataea, which was a Greek victory over the Persian armies in 479 BC. And Herodotus is a true storyteller. He knows how to guide his reader to get the reader to sort of feel the emotion of the point that he's building him toward with this true narrator's flair. And as he describes this battle, he's building to the point where the Greek forces led by the Spartan general called Pausanias capture the royal command tent off the Persians. It's the next best thing to capturing a palace. And this is how Herodotus describes that electric moment. Treasures there were in plenty, tents full of gold and silver furniture, couches overlaid with precious metals, bowls, goblets, and cups all made of gold. When Pausanias saw it, with its embroidered hangings and gorgeous decorations, he could hardly believe his eyes. It's a wonderful quote. And what it does, I think, is a couple of things. First of all, it's showing us quite realistically, quite evocatively, the astonishment at the riches that ancient Persia and the East represented to the much more simple living and resource poor ancient Greeks. But also, we're introducing a historical perception of bias here. The key words are, well, that last sentence, he could hardly believe his eyes. This is a world of perceptions. And what Herodotus is doing is building us towards a trope in which the Greeks have to explain how they, this network of small independent city-states, managed to pull off these spectacular surprise victories against the largest empire the world had seen looming on their eastern frontier. And when they are confronted by these sorts of luxuries, the ... the implication is, well, no wonder the Persians lost. They become corrupted, weakened, softened, feminized by luxurious living. They had become decadent. And of course, through the glass darkly, the reflection of that is, unlike us, we're clean living, simple living, plain living, honest Greeks. So we have a historical dichotomy emerge in our historical record, one of the Greeks versus the Persians. And you can kind of see that binary in these two objects here. And if you visit the exhibition, you'll see these in the first case actually facing face to face when you walk into the exhibition space. One made of stone looks like a Persian. It's got a luscious, fulsome Persian beard, Persian-style snail curl ringlets, very luxurious hairstyle, probably oiled and scented. The one in bronze, much more simple, much more plain, with a standard Greek knot of Heracles above its forehead, looks more like an Apollo figure, a bronze, classical, bronze sort of Apollo figure. One Persian, one Greek. And yet, here's the thing. They weren't found hundreds or thousands of kilometers apart. They were found 40 kilometers apart on the island of Cyprus, both on statues standing in cultic sanctuaries. And if you had a souped-up donkey. You could have visited both in the course of one day. And the point is this: ancient Cyprus, in this case, is a remarkably cosmopolitan place at this time. Sure, various Cypriot kings swore fealty to the Persian Empire, but this was an island that was home to Greek-speaking, Persian-speaking, Eastern Phoenician and speaking, local Cypriot-speaking communities, all of which were reaching for different styles of luxuries, different aesthetic languages to reflect their own sorts of identities depending on different contexts. And although these statue heads look so different at first glance, when you look at them, actually those differences kind of fade away. Because the stone statue, despite its Persian beard, has a Greek-style wreath above its head, and it almost certainly would have been dressed in a Greek-style chiton, tunic. And the bronze statue, although it looks quite Greek, was found near a sanctuary to an Eastern Phoenician god, Resheph. So it was probably a Greek statue, or a Greek god, but represented in an Eastern fashion. Those historical binaries blur. And what this exhibition is trying to do is to take these objects, these materials that these various cultures left behind, and go, okay, let's read between the lines of our historical records, and let's look at the way these different cultures, so defined by their political opposites, were actually engaged in much more nuanced visual exchanges. And we're doing that through the lens of luxury. So the exhibition, and in fact, for the next 40 minutes or so for this talk, we've divided this kind of into three sections. The first section deals with the Achaemenid period Iran. The second section will then look into early democratic Athens. And finally, in the third section, we'll go back to Iran, but an ancient Persian empire that is under the conquest of the Kingdom of Macedon. Alexander III, Alexander the Great. So to start with that first section, I spoke very briefly about the Persian tent. This is a monarchical society in which absolute power is rested in the figure of the king. And at the site of Persepolis, one of those major Persian capital cities, this one in southwestern Iran in the Zagros Mountains, we have on the ruins of the royal area wonderful elaborate sculptures. One of which is this. It's called the audience scene, and it's showing the Persian king sitting on his throne. And you can see here some of the tropes in which luxury is setting him apart from those who are serving him. The king is not supposed to walk on the ground. He rides a horse, or his feet rest on a footrest, or he walks on plush carpets. The king doesn't breathe the standard normal pedestrian air, and those two beehive-looking upright things between the king and the person presenting to him, they're actually incense burners and probably represent pure silver ones, burning incense such as frankincense from the exotic shores of Arabia. And although you don't see it here, but we'll come to it later on, very often the king has a parasol bearer above him because, of course, the king doesn't get the rays of the sun. He keeps himself shaded, unlike everyday people. So luxury is a very powerful political tool, but it's not only a very powerful political tool to define the king and his position, but it's being used as a highly sophisticated tool of imperial statecraft that's binding this massive empire that includes hundreds of different cultural groups with dozens of different languages, that it's using luxury as a kind of lingua franca, if you like, blending these people together, tying this diverse empire to an imperial core. And in so doing, luxury is actually strengthening an empire rather than, as the Greeks would argue, causing decadence, corruption, and enfeebling it. And one of the ways it does that is through tribute. This is one of the relief scenes from Persepolis, and you can see tribute bearers from a Western kingdom in Turkey or Anatolia, probably Lycian from the Lycian kingdom, bringing in luxury goods as tribute to the king. And these objects are on display in the exhibition. You can see gold armlets, such as the one on the left, silver drinking bowls, such as the one in the middle, and one of our objects we've borrowed from our colleagues in Bulgaria, a spouted wine amphora, so a wine jug, but one through which, in this case, you can see the spike off the handle, wine was poured. Crafted luxury goods from using the resources from the empire, the artisanship of its peoples, brought in to the center to sort of centralize wealth. But it's more than that. It's both centrifugal and centripetal forces operating together. Because as the king would travel around the empire, across the royal roads connecting all the various cities, moving his mobile court between his various capitals as part of his seasonal migration route, he would invite local kings who had swore fealty to him, local governors called satraps, local aristocracies to dine and to feast with him. And I know someone in the museum here who was very proud because she got an invitation to the royal garden party following the coronation on the weekend. And oh man, was she planning for this for days. New outfit, new hat, went to the hairdressers, and that's exactly the same sort of response the Persian king would have got when he had invited people to dine with him in his tent. We know this from the descriptions in the historical record. And when you were there, the king would gift as largesse paraphernalia associated with the Persian court. For example, this is we're looking at it top down, but it's a very large silver serving platter. And around the edge on the circumference is a cuneiform script. Now, cuneiform is an ancient Middle Eastern script done as sort of wedge-shaped impressions onto wet clay. Think a drunk chicken has danced a tango over a wet cement, and you can kind of get what it looks like. But like our own alphabet, which, you know, you can pick up a page of writing, could be English or French or German or Dutch, cuneiform supported a number of different languages, in this case, Old Persian. And the inscription around the edges says that this was made in the house of the Persian king. Made in the house of the Persian king. Really important because it wasn't found in any of these capitals. It's found far off in the boondocks of outer Iran. Perhaps one of those gifts that the king gives out. Because this is key. Once he gives these gifts, these other smaller kings who swore fealty, the local aristocrats, local rulers, hold court themselves. And they use the same paraphernalia that the king uses. They emulate what the royal court looks like to project their own authority. They buy into the visual language of royalty and of power through the luxury goods with which it's associated. And it's nothing subtle about that, because if you're a king in the middle of, or the edge of the empire, who's boasting about being a drinking buddy of the king, that phrase drinking buddy actually translates into an old Persian particular title. Well, you don't have to say to everyone, well, take my word for it. You can get them to read the actual silverware. Look, this one was made in the house of the king. I'm giving you my credentials, my authorities. Key to this kind of prestigious dining are objects called write-ons. We've got 3 on front of you here, one from the British Museum, one from the Louvre, one from Armenia. These look like drinking horns, but they're not. They're wine pouring objects. So in each of them, you can see a high horn rising up. That's kind of like where someone would pour wine into. And then they've got an animal or a beast or even a human figure as an end called a proton. And through that, there's a small spout. So you can see one that is from the British Museum. It's got horns of a griffin. You can see hanging around its neck is a pendant with a recess. Into that recess would have been a semi-precious stone. It's hard to see in this image. Well, I have to come into the exhibition, but between the 4 parts of this beast, there's then a small spout coming out, sort of the outflow spout. So imagine that I'm a Persian king reclining on a couch. This is an era of reclining dining. And I would hold that write-on up in one hand and stop the spout with my thumb. And a servant or an attendant would fill that with wine. By the way, that one, the Griffin one, can hold about 1.5 liters, or 1.5 bottles of red wine. Don't ask me how I know that, but it does. And then on the other hand, the king would balance on dexterously on the fingertips of 3 fingers, a small drinking bowl. And then he would unstop the spout, to release a stream of wine to spurt into a bowl. This is drinking theatrically, ostentatiously, with showmanship and panache. And imagine in a sort of an evening feast in this royal tent setting where there's flickering torches capturing the gold and the silver drinking vessels, the red spurt of wine. It really is an element of showmanship. And there's a really cool dialectic going on here, because the king, by using the rhyton, is bestowing prestige upon that object in front of all of his subjects, just as that gold and silver rhyton, by being an object of luxury, is bestowing prestige upon the king. And so when he gifts out gifts such as this, and they're being used throughout all the various courts, you can see, like throwing a stone into a pond, the rippling kind of style of luxury permeating through all the edges of the Persian Empire. And here we've got two of our collection managers when we were measuring this sort of stuff up, trying to work out the angle which we would display it and the relationship between bowl and rhyton. And you can see how these sorts of things were copied throughout the empire. What you're looking at now is a relief from the Nereid monument. We've got the tomb facade of this Nereid monument reconstructed in the British Museum. It was made for a tomb for a king called Urbanus. He's a West Anatolian, West Turkish king, right on the fringes of the Persian Empire, but swore fealty to the Persian king. So we're right on the cusp here between the Greek world and the Persian world. And you can see the influence of the Greek world here, because he's built his tomb to look like a Greek temple. And yet, look at the insignias of authority that he has chosen to represent himself with on the actual detail. Here you see him reclining and drinking like a Persian. He's got a full Persian beard, he's got the rhyton in one hand and the bowl in the other. He may look Greek, but he's really using Persian luxury to symbol his power. And so you see that horizontal spread of luxury across the courts of the entire Middle East and Central Asia, rippling out from the imperial centers of Iran. But you see it trickling down the social strata as well. Those objects on one side are made of elite gold and silver and pearls and glass. These are objects that you would quite comfortably see in the court of the Persian king. But I've contrasted these with other objects that are made in bronze, made in clay, terracotta, that kind of reference those royal ones. Those ones made in cheaper materials were all found in tombs of a Persian garrison at a place called Deve Huyuk. This is near a site called Karkemish on the modern border between Syria and Turkey. So imagine being stationed out of that as a Persian soldier during the Persian Empire. This is someone who would not dine with the Persian king. And yet you can see in this cheaper materials how they're reaching for those same styles of royal dining, those same styles of luxury. So in one here, I think you can see the Rolex produced by the boutique watchmaker. And on the other one, you can see the sort of Rolex that you can buy on one of the street vendors outside Tottenham Court Road station here in London. The same sort of thing, but permeating down the social scale. And very quickly, I just want to show you a short video. It doesn't have any sound, so you won't listen to it. This is on another form of luxury, which we're including in the exhibition, which is about making purple pigment. So purple by weight, dried powdered purple pigment by weight in the ancient world was worth more than its weight than gold. It's worth more than its weight than gold even in the modern world, including a couple of examples that we've included on display in the exhibition. It comes from these shells. These are Murex shells. This particular guy doing it off the coast of Tunisia, and he's extracting a gland that it secretes a mucus. He's now drying the gland before he manages to secrete that mucus. And the mucus, which is coming up in the next shot, turns purple when it's exposed to UV light. And when that's dried and refined into a powdered form, it creates a rare purple pigment that is used to dye a color, which purple doesn't really occur very often in the natural world. This is one of the rare instances that it does. And so Phoenicians on the coast of Lebanon, or people on the coast of North Africa, held the recipe for this type of luxury secret, and the Achaemenid overlords let them get on with it because it was an important part of imperial luxury that the Persian kings would use themselves. Now, that's all well and good into classical Athens. In Athens, which of course was one of the leaders against the Persian invasions of the first half of the 5th century BC, we're in a different form of political system. Classical Athens, by the 5th century, has emerged as a democracy. Demos, people, kratos, power, people power, although it's a word that the ancient Greeks perhaps wouldn't have used for themselves at this time. In the 6th century, so the sort of the 100 years before the Persian Wars, it wasn't a democracy. Athens was ruled by competing aristocratic clans, and they used luxury, particularly luxury from the East, as ways of gaining social leverage and political edge. But the scale of luxury is so much more smaller and so much more understated compared to the resource-rich Persian Empire. And these two pots, I think, sort of show that. There's one which is showing an aristocratic hunting and riding were really the main ways of showing your social class. And the one on the right that shows the Zeus and Athena, but Zeus is sitting on a white chair that could sort of represent an ivory chair, with ivory imported from Egypt or the Middle East. So these Eastern exotica were around, but a much less kind of dramatic scale than what we're seeing in the Persian Empire. By the 5th century BC, however, Athens has formed new laws which create political power, vest political power in the hands of its citizens rather than the hands of its wealthy or inherited sort of family lines. And in part, that's a reaction to these competing aristocratic clans for whom luxury is a very real tool and which cause a lot of unrest and violence to emerge in the city at particular points in time. So democracy really comes out of laws being enacted to kind of suppress the violence, and in doing so create a much more sort of equal investment in or access to political authority if you happen to be male rather than female or an enslaved person or a foreign-born resident. But that's another story. The main point is that when the Persians invade, first in 490 at Marathon and then in 480, 479, Athens is a fairly young democracy, still trying to figure out what that actually means. And when they pull off with their Greek allies this surprise victory against the Persians, those victories are seminal into the emerging kind of sense of civic pride of what it is meant to be Athenians. And they define themselves as much by what they are not, the barbarian, decadent, luxurious other, than by what they are as well. You can see the response to the Persians in objects such as this, which are really ramming home the political propaganda and the political triumphalism over the Persian Wars. This is a drinking cup of a Persian soldier. It's Athens made. We know he's a Persian because he's wearing a leather cap. He's got a Persian beard, and he looks quite terrified. You can see him being brought up, confronted with every drunken sip by his vanquisher, the honest Athenian citizen. That humiliation's compounded twice over, because around the edge, around the lip of this pot, you can see that he's been put into a feminine scene, this Persian warrior. You'll see on one side an Athenian woman sitting down, probably at toilette in her chambers, applying makeup or looking at herself in a mirror. And then she's being waited on by a serving girl. But the serving girl is wearing trousers. And this is really important, because for the Greeks, to wear trousers was the ultimate form of barbarianism. Sleeves for your legs? Are you insane? That's what they do, not us. So this servant girl is probably a Persian slave girl. So you see him terrified, surmounted by a feminine scene with the Persian slave girl, the effects of the hubris of the Persian Empire to try to invade the Greek peninsula. The problem for Athens, of course, is that over the 5th century becomes increasingly wealthy, in part from booty captured off the Persians and in part from sort of locally generated wealth, particularly through some local silver mines. And so Athens, although it's emerged in this democratic system to reject or suppress social inequality or ostentatious wealth, it gets this kind of practical and philosophical problem about what to do with all of this wealth. Nothing in excess was a maxim that was inscribed on the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, a fairly tight three-word reminder of where Greek we do things with self-restraint and self-discipline. The Greek, or the Athenian statesman Pericles, gave a famous funerary oration on the eve of the Peloponnesian War, significantly after the Persian War. But he talks about democratization of luxury. The greatness of our city draws the produce of the world into our harbour, he said, so that to the Athenian the fruits of other countries are as familiar a luxury as those of his own. But then he goes on, and this is the key kicker: our love of what is beautiful does not lead us to extravagance. We regard wealth as something to be properly used, rather than as something to boast about. Pericles here is talking about a kind of shared wealth, that wealth is okay when it's used properly and shared by the community, where there's been a collective levelling up, if you like, that the entire citizenry now can be regarded as elite, engaging with the luxuries of the entire world. And it's okay because when it's shared and properly used, as he says, it's for the glory of the city and not for any one person, not for something to boast about. So unlike luxury in the East, where it's very much tagged to political ostentation, here it's all about collective democratic ownership. And you can see that in places like the Parthenon. So the Parthenon, originally the wooden Parthenon, had been burned when the Persians took control of Athens, albeit briefly in 480 BC, and burned the temples of the Acropolis to the ground. As Athens becomes increasingly wealthy over the course of the 5th century, Pericles oversees the reconstruction of the Parthenon in marble, literally over the ashes, over the ruins of the one the Persians had destroyed. And that's the Parthenon that we have today. But we also have these sorts of stela that belong to the Parthenon, that were erected around the Acropolis, that give us a bit more of an insight as to the function of this temple. The Parthenon was a temple. It was there as the house of Athena, the great goddess of Athens, but it was more than just a temple. In fact, it really served as a repository of the city's wealth. This is, of course, a period before banks. And as Athens is capturing this extraordinary booty from the East, and as its citizens are getting wealthier and making dedications to the goddesses, it has to go somewhere, and it's kept in the Parthenon. And these stela erected around the edges are those inventory. This is the Excel spreadsheet that the treasurers would produce at the end of every year, just to give an account of what's there. This one goes through all the gold and silver metal vessels in the collections, including animal-headed vessels, almost certainly looted from the Persian East. These luxuries are coming and flowing into the city, but not for individual use, for the use of the gods. In other words, for collective use by the city. And when they're listed, they're always listed by weights. They're serving almost as bullion, that they could be melted down for the city's defense, should they need it. This is a relief from the East frieze of the Parthenon. It's showing part of the Pan-Athenate procession, the major religious procession during the Athenians' religious calendar. And you can see some of those vessels listed on a stele such as that, carried by these 5 young women. Can you see what the leading figure is carrying? It looks like a kind of microphone, like she's about to do stand-up comedy in the bar, but it's not that. It's one of those incense burners associated with Persian aristocracy, quite likely a silver one, and very likely one captured off the Persians themselves. In other words, part of the looted booty, which is stored in the temple and brought out as trophies to be paraded through the streets every year, a reminder of the collective wealth gathered by the Athenians and by their triumph over the Persians, who burned down the Parthenon, which is now like a phoenix risen from the ashes. But people are people, and luxury is sticky. And you can reject ostentatious wealth all you want, but people will always find ways to gain social advantage. And private luxury does exist in Athens, and in this city where personal aggrandizement is frowned upon, even has threats of ostracization from the city, luxury could be a very dangerous thing indeed. And you can see that on a quote with tongue placed firmly in cheek by the satirist Aristophanes in the play The Wasp, about somebody buying fish at the markets. Everyone ate fish in Athens. Everyone knew the various prices of the different species. And this is what Aristophanes wrote. If you are buying gurnards, a very expensive species, and don't want anchovies, the cheap stuff, the huckster next door who is selling the latter at once exclaims, "That is a man whose kitchen savours of tyranny." If you're using luxury to self-promote, that's a tremendously destabilizing force in the political landscape. And you can see Athenian craftsmen bending Persian sorts of luxuries around the edges of these dangers to try and form something that's quite new, but acceptable to the Athenian landscape. And you see that particularly with the symposium. Now, the symposium is the standard Greek and Athenian way of drinking. It's where men, always men, would gather together in a particular dining hall or somebody's house. Their reclining drinking couches would be lined up along the inside walls of the room so that no one was preeminent than the other, and they would drink together. And I've got a quote which I love, which describes a symposium. "3 bowls of wine only do I mix for the sensible. One is dedicated to health, the second to love and pleasure, the third to sleep. When this is drunk up, wise guests go home. The 4th bowl is ours no longer, but belongs to outrage, the 5th to arguments, the 6th to drunken revels, the 7th to black eyes, the 8th is the bailiff, the 9th belongs to bitter anger, and the 10th to madness that makes people throw things." Honestly, it's the best description of the British Museum staff Christmas party that I've ever read. That aside, and the shenanigans of the symposium aside, you can see in these animal-headed vessels an Athenian response to those Persian rite-ons. Those Persian rite-ons, the wine-flowing vessels, are anathema to this symposium, where men drink inequality. And yet Athenian potters are responding to them in innovative ways. But they're almost subversive because they're taking those rite-on forms, which would have been held in the treasuries of the Parthenon, which would have come out on parades, and they're making them almost like a joke. Imagine the one in the center, that donkey-headed drinking bowl, drinking from that at one of these symposiums and literally turning into an ass in front of your guffawing friends. It's a very subversive take on that prestigious Achaemenid rite-on. But my favorite in here, and in fact, this is my favorite object in the entire exhibition, is this drinking cup here. So all of these are drinking mugs. The Greeks can't really come at the flowing wine thing. So they slap on a handle and it's a mug from which you drink. But of course, with the animal head, you can't put it down. So once that's full, you're there until it's drunk. This is showing the head of a bird of prey. You can see the pointed beak. You can see the sharp eye with the heavy eyebrow ridge. But imagine once you've finally drunk that to put it down. It can only rest on the rim. So it's got to be turned upside down and placed on the rim. And when it does, it transforms. No longer is it the head of a bird, it's now an entire bird perched. That beak transformed into the hooded head of this bird of prey. The eyebrow ridge now, the heavy sort of winged shoulders of this bird. Perhaps the decoration around the rim almost indicating the tail feathers. It's a remarkable, playful and creative response by Athenian potters to Persian forms. I spoke also briefly about how the Persian king would always be shaded by a parasol. Well, parasols are one of those Eastern trends that get picked up and brought into Athens at this time, but not in the way you think. Now we can see here, remember the Nereid monument of King Urbanus in Turkey using the Rhiton to showcase his authority? He's using these Persian forms as well. But in Athens, sure, this Eastern form of luxury gets adopted, but it's feminized. It's neutered of its political power because it's used by women. And remember, in this democracy, women don't have any political role at all. So it's being subversive. It's taken a very Persian form of macho authority and making it acceptable in the Greek forum, in the Greek landscape. In this case, used by women with nothing more arduous to do than select jewelry from a casket such as this figure here, while their servant or slave, who is no longer doing anything productive, is shading her. A real inversion of the luxury and power used in the East. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to bolt through this section very fast, but then we come to the third section, which is the world of Alexander. And this is where the kingdom of Macedon, kingdom again, not a democracy, this is a monarchical society again, comes out of northern Greece, North Macedonia, takes control of the Greek peninsula under Philip of Macedon, Alexander III's father, and then Alexander III pushes through the entire Persian Empire as far as Central Asia, ultimately before he dies at Babylon in 323 BC. And when our Greek authors are explaining the apparent ease at which Alexander is doing this invasion, those tropes of luxury are already inculcated within the Greek Macedonian psyche. Oh, the Persians were so soft and decadent from their luxurious living, they were ready to crumble at the breath of the first advancing Macedonian soldier. The thing is, the Persian Empire was remarkably strong at this time. Sure, it was out-generaled and out-manned, but the political apparatus and architecture holding it together was remarkably cohesive. And Alexander uses that when he takes control of the empire, keeping many of the same governors, many of the same officials. More to the point, he recognizes the absolute fundamental role that luxury plays in legitimizing authority and perpetuating it around the empire as a way of buying into hearts and minds of this culturally diverse space. However, up till now, I've been talking about luxury going east to west. We also start to see styles of luxury traveling from west to east. The funerary wreath that you're seeing on the right could very well come from the tomb of Alexander's father, Philip of Macedon. Several like this were found in his tomb at Vergina. This one, which is on display in the exhibition and one of our objects at the British Museum, is one from Anatolia. So it's a Greek Macedonian style moving into the east. If you do come to the exhibition, try and find two cicadas that are beautifully hidden amongst those gorgeous oak leaf foliage. There's two of them, they're there, good luck. They're really well hidden. So, of course, we're back into Persia, or the world of Greater Persia, under Alexander himself. And what we start to see is a new form of luxury, a new form of visual aesthetic emerge, creating an exchange of ideas and of tropes and of stories and narratives between all of these sorts of connected worlds. And you can see this on this gilt silver plate here, done in the Hellenistic style. That new culture, by the way, getting that name, the Hellenistic culture, after sort of becoming Greek, but much more is really a hybrid of Greek, Eastern, various local styles together. This is showing the marriage of Dionysus, the Greek god of wine, of drinking, to the daughter of King Minos of Crete, Ariadne. So you see Dionysus on a chariot, reclining with a drinking bowl, and near his elbow, resting on the couch, you can see the quite diminutive figure of Ariadne, almost like a concubine. When you see this same scene repeated in the classical world, and you do, such as on this Roman period sarcophagus, right on the edge of this sarcophagus, underneath the figure of Dionysus on the plate, you can see how it's more traditionally depicted in the classical world. Ariadne and Dionysus together on the chariot. So what we're seeing here is an Eastern version of this very classically Greek story. And that's particularly important because this classical Greek story on the plate isn't from anywhere near Greece. This is from Afghanistan, hundreds, thousands of kilometers further east. So you can see the projection, the blending of cultural styles. I'm running out of time, so I'll skip through that one. One of the other things that you see emerging in this Hellenistic world are new centers of craft production. And one of those areas you'll see developing is glass. Glassware hits a renaissance at this period of time. You can see extraordinary glass starting to rival, for the first time, gold and silver as the objects of absolute luxury at the tables of royalty and at the tables of elite families. However, the absolute pièce de résistance of this section, and in fact the whole crescendo of the exhibition, is this set of 9 gold feasting vessels. These are on loan to us from our colleagues at the National History Museum in Sofia, Bulgaria. Ancient Bulgaria was ancient Thrace, and ancient Thrace had been conquered by the Persians at some point. Greek settlements had settled around the Black Sea coast and were trading for gold throughout this period, and then later it becomes absorbed into the Macedonian Empire. So a real crossroads between what we're talking about here. These feasting vessels had been cached in the ground, probably at some point during the 2nd or 1st century BC, when the whole area was being threatened by a Celtic invasion. And then whoever buried them, something bad happened, and they were there all the way up until 1949, when 3 Bulgarian brothers, named the Dakov brothers, were digging clay in a clay pit for making bricks at a local brick factory, the city of Panagurishti in central Bulgaria. And this treasure, the Panagurishti treasure, gets its name from their find spot. The treasure was made around 300 BC. So we're talking a couple of decades after the death of Alexander. And they were almost certainly made for a Thracian king, probably Suethes III, although we don't know who. But they really bind the end point of this exhibition together quite remarkably, I think. Because from a Persian and Greek point of view, they show both these influences coming together. You've got the libation bowl or a drinking bowl in the center, but every single other vessel is actually a rhyton. It's a wine pouring vessel. Even the one that looks like mugs, they all have spouts for pouring wine, as you would a Persian, coming from the lower mouths or the lower parts of the vessels. So in form and in function, they're quite Eastern, quite Persian. But in decoration, they're quite Greek. You can see the Greek-headed drinking cups for some of them, shaped as either Amazonian women or even the god Athena. But the figures around these vessels show Greek myth, scenes from Greek myth, Paris judging the beauty contest between the 3 Greek goddesses, for example. So you're getting a really interesting blend of both East and West coming together in this superb, supreme collection of absolute bling. But it does more than that. It brings together these key tropes that I started about luxury and power. So look at that central vessel that we've got here. It's a spouted amphora. So it's like a wine jar, an amphora. It's got 2 handles shaped as centaurs. And then right down the bottom, you can see 2 little bulges coming off the base. There it spouts, not 1, but 2 spouts. So it would have 2 twin streams of wine flowing out of this vessel. Now that's interesting and really unusual. So imagine a Thracian king who has celebrated marrying his daughter to a nearby Thracian king, or settling a peace settlement, or made some sort of commercial agreement. Imagine that king in front of all the assembled parties, grabbing one of those centaur handles, his colleague, opponent, who he's made an agreement with, grabbing the other one, and the wine flowing out, 2 streams from the same vessel into 2 collecting drinking bowls. This is real Games of Thrones stuff, because this is a period in which poisoning was a very real tool in the toolkit of political advancement. So by drinking from the same vessel, they've eliminated that threat. And in fact, demonstrating very publicly through this luxurious drinking set their respect and their trust in their opponent. And when we open the exhibition, last week, the Vice President of Bulgaria flew over to mark the occasion of the loan of the Panagurishti treasure to Britain. She and the director of the British Museum didn't drink together from this vessel, although I wish they had, but her presence and a wonderful speech she gave was a real reminder that even though this set is over 2,000 years old, it still continues to play a political role in the cultural landscape of today. I guess the takeaway point to all of this, and I hope if you do come and see the exhibition, the takeaway observations to make is that although we've inherited this kind of trope about being uneasy about luxury from our Greek sources, that luxury is something we aspire to and yet we are cynical about, we're deeply suspicious of its motives. Well, in the ancient world, there's far more to luxury than simple decadence. And there's far more to decadence, far more to Persians, than luxurious excess. So I would finish there, but we've got a few more minutes. So what I'm going to do very quickly is bolt through a couple of the behind the scenes of how this exhibition came to fruition, because I think that's always fun to see. Oh, and there's those three Dakoff brothers, by the way, finding those vessels in 1949. Exhibitions at the British Museum usually have quite a long run-up. This is a big thing to organise, and often they take around 5 or 6 years. Because of the COVID pandemic, this one was a little shorter. We did it in just under 2. But it starts by a curator working out what story we want to tell, working out what objects we want to use, and there's actually a whole series of boards we can use where we've got images and they move around, and then they start to come off when you don't want to start refining them down, and it's a tremendously creative period of that exhibition. Designers then start to design up the exhibition space around the objects, and the objects in the order that you as the curator want to tell them in, which ones need to be grouped, which ones need to come in before or after, which ones need to speak to other objects visually in the same space. A really interesting period to work with the designer at that point. This floor plan was one of about 16 that were done in this sort of process of continued discussion. That turns into a 3D model, so we can actually get a sense of the space of how these objects and the floor plan would flow, whether might be bottlenecks so that people can continually walk around and observe. And then that exhibition space has to get built, particularly for the exhibition. Sort of the architecture gets put in place. In this particular case, we've got drapes like the Persian tent adorning the display. And you can see here our lighting designer in behind the scenes playing around with a bolt of fabric we had purchased several months before, seeing how they take the different lights, working out what kind of light scheme may or may not be appropriate. We do extra research around the exhibitions. In this case, we did research around Persian costumes with the bloke here who's called Professor Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones. He's an expert on Persian costume. Textiles are really important to this exhibition. You can't tell stories of luxury without costumes and textiles. But of course, they don't survive in the archaeological record. And just as we saw King Charles standing up in his regalia last weekend, the Persian king, when he stood up, was supposedly in about 3 million quid, £3 million worth of textiles and adornments. So we recreated 2 costumes that go alongside these objects to tell part of the story. Objects then on display come out of the cases before or after opening. They get measured up to make sure we've got their dimensions right. We twist their orientations to see what would work. We start putting them in conversation with each other to work out how they might be displayed within those various cases. And then finally, when we start installing, our colleagues from various loaning institutions, in this case, these are 2 colleagues from 2 museums in Armenia that have loaned some key objects to the exhibition. They come over to help install their objects before we then install our British Museum objects carefully and with a lot of mounting excitement. And then, of course, the event gets opened. I mentioned the Bulgarian president or vice president. Here she is inspecting the Bulgarian treasure with our own director, Hartwig Fischer. And then the exhibition is open for anyone to see. And in this case, we're open until the 13th of August. So those in London, you must come and see it. Those not in London, you must get here to come and see it. But if you can't, there's always the exhibition book, which I've written in conjunction with Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones and another curatorial colleague. which you can, of course, get through the British Museum's website. And finally, just to thank the sponsors of this exhibition. We can't mount these exhibitions without significant support. In this case, the American Friends of the British Museum and Bullion Vault are taking very much the lead of this sponsorship. Thank you, everybody, for listening to this presentation and for turning up and being interested in this exhibition. Should you visit it and see me in the galleries of this exhibition space, come and say hello, please do. I've skated across the top of so many interesting stories that I could give you, as I'm sure you've guessed by now, several hours worth of lectures on every single one of the objects in the display. I'd happily talk you through some of them in the gallery itself. Thank you so much.
Jamie, thank you very much indeed for that thrilling introduction to what is a really extraordinary exhibition. And if you haven't seen it yet, to echo Jamie's words, I urge you to try and find a way of coming to London, because it is well worth the visit. Now, we've got a few minutes left on our allotted time, and inevitably there have been a lot of questions emerging as a result of Jamie's wonderful talk. So in the few minutes we've got, I'll try and share a few of them with Jamie, but I apologize in advance if I don't get to all of them. So just as a selection, Jamie, if you're ready, there's a question here about the suggestion that the ancient Persians intentionally used wealth precisely to bind the empire together. I think that's where you started. Perhaps the questioner asks, was this an unintended but beneficial consequence of a display of wealth?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And there's a lot of debate in scholarship about this. I think it's both. I think the Persian king is creating this style of luxury, this court style of luxury, quite deliberately. And the way, I mean, we know Xenophon, one of our Greek sources, says that he commands his satraps, his governors, to go out and repeat exactly the sorts of things that he's doing in the court. So it's very deliberate, very engineered. But I suspect what you don't see, and what is perhaps an unintended consequence, is not only that horizontal, but that vertical move down the social class, sort of binding it together from the bottom up as much as the top down. And I think that perhaps is unintended, but certainly helps kind of bring the hearts and minds via the luxury aesthetic to the one place.
Thank you. And question from Ben Davies, was the shared wealth of Athens seen in the other states of the Delian League, or was this a mainly Athenian phenomenon?
Yeah, great question as well. The Delian League, of course, is an alliance of these Greek city-states that forms to protect Greece from the Persians, and then to liberate those Greek states in Ionia on the west coast of modern-day Turkey that had already fallen under Persian hegemony. And of course, the Greek-Persian wars drag on for about 50 years with various sort of flares. And Athens emerges as the head of this league, which then transforms into an empire, sort of the first Aegean empire of ancient Athens. Yes, what you're seeing in Athens about this shared wealth, you're seeing in other kind of, or very similar other democratic city-states throughout the Greek peninsula. Corinth being one, for example. But not all the Greek city-states have this. There's a number of different Greek city-states, all of which with their own particular kind of form of government. This would be anathema to Sparta, for example. Which doesn't have this sort of stuff at all. So it is. Thebes, of course, would emerge doing the same sort of thing a bit later on, following the sort of the golden age of Athens itself.
Thank you. And then Jenny McTurk asks, did the parasol on the Parthenon iconic frieze shading Aphrodite evolve from the Persian parasol?
Yes, there has been a lot of ink spilt over this, so well picked up on that one. The book to read, or at least the articles to read, are by an American scholar called Margaret Coolroot, but also a Canadian scholar from my old alma mater who teaches at the University of Sydney has written a lot about this as well, called Margaret Miller. And yes, the parasol is certainly an Eastern form. I mean, it comes in from the East. Now, whether by this time that it's built in the Parthenon, they're putting there specifically to reference the East, or whether it's there now as an Athenian thing over which they've kind of claimed their own cultural ownership, well, that's the crux around which the debate flows. I don't have one particular answer on it. I suspect they were still looking at it as being fairly Persian, but others would disagree.
Great, thank you. I'm going to try and squeeze in two more questions as our time ticks by. Ben Davies asks, another question from Ben, do the Seleucid monarchs continue Alexander's trend of accepting Persian luxury, or do they act in a more Greek manner for their luxury items?
Yeah, the Seleucids are interesting, isn't it? They do both, essentially. More Greek, perhaps, but of course they pick up a lot of, mostly the Egyptian forms of the kind of projection of power than anything else. We've got in the exhibition, at the very beginning, a small naos, a small wooden shrine, in which the Persian king Darius is framing himself as an Egyptian pharaoh in ancient Greece. And we've got quite close to the end, an alabaster statue, either of Alexander or of the general Seleucid, who are framing themselves as an Egyptian pharaoh, just as that one of Darius did several hundred years before. So I think the key thing about the Seleucids is the Egyptianization with which they're doing it, as much as they are Greek or indeed Persian.
And I'm going to end with a very wide-ranging question, which is from Joanne Taylor. How does the subject of this exhibition relate to the world we live in today?
Joanne, it's a great question, and I think it resonates so much about the contemporary world. Because you look at the Kardashians, you look at those kind of celebrity red carpet luxury, and we love to be cynical about them. We love to deride their motives. We're suspicious of luxury, and yet we covet it. We aspire to it. It's something that we want. And I think in that paradox of our modern attitudes to luxury, we're hearing the echoes of those original ancient Greek authors, filtered through the Romans, filtered through the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and all this other stuff. But you're hearing this kind of leitmotif that was set at this cusp between Southeast Europe and the Middle East, between Athens and Greece, between Athens and Persia, that's happening over 2,000 years ago. And I think you can't understand our modern attitude towards luxury and the Kardashians without understanding Pericles. There you go. I've linked the Kardashians to Pericles. Paul, I think it's time to call it a day where we've hit that point.
Thank you, Jamie. I think you set some things up nicely, very much at the end there. So it just leaves me to tell you a little bit about our next event, which is on Friday, the 19th of May at the British Museum. And that will be on music of ancient Greece, so not a totally unrelated subject. And you can book tickets on the British Museum website. But for the moment, it just leaves me to thank Jamie for a really exciting and interesting and illuminating talk, inviting you all to Luxury and Power at the British Museum. And thank you all very much for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.